I never thought the hands I once held as children would be the same ones to throw me out like yesterday's trash. My own daughter and her husband stripped me of my home, my pride, and left me standing on a cold New Orleans street with nothing but a grocery bag of clothes. But what they didn't know was that fate had already set the table for me, their table. And when I pulled out the chair, they learned the bill was mine to collect. Get ready, because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about a reckoning served hot. Comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. My name is Etta Rose Whitaker, and I am 69 years old. I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I never thought the same streets that once carried my laughter would later carry my tears. I tell this story not for pity but for truth, because when betrayal comes from strangers, it wounds the flesh, but when it comes from your own blood, it carves into the soul. I am a mother, a grandmother, and once I believed I was the very heart of my family. My daughter, Brooke, was the apple of my eye. I raised her in our little shotgun house in the Garden District, where magnolia trees shaded the sidewalks and neighbors greeted each other with a smile. I gave her everything a mother could give: food when money was short, prayers when nights were long, and love that never asked for payment. But love, I've learned, can be twisted when pride enters the picture. Brooke married a man named Neil Daniels, smooth-talking and sharp as a blade. He wore his suits like armor and his smile like bait. In the beginning I welcomed him. I told myself he was ambitious, that he wanted the best for my daughter. But ambition without a conscience is a wolf dressed for Sunday service. I sit here now, remembering how they would dress up every Friday night and drive off to their favorite restaurant, Palmetto and Pine, a fine Creole place in the French Quarter. They would laugh about their spot, their balcony table 7, the seat that overlooked Bourbon Street, where music spilled into the night air and the smell of jambalaya drifted through open windows. That table was their stage. It was where they showed the world how high they had climbed, while I stayed home watching their children, ironing their clothes and keeping their life stitched together. I used to think their success was mine too, that a mother's joy is tied to her children's rise. But I did not see how the shine in their lives grew brighter only when it reflected off my back. I was the one they leaned on, yet the one they chose to cast aside. When I tell you they betrayed me, I don't mean in some small careless way. I mean they opened their hands, palms I had filled with love and sacrifice, and they pushed me into the street as though I were an old chair put out for the garbage man. They did not stumble into this cruelty. They planned it, dressed it up, and called it necessity. I was 69 years old, and I had lived through hurricanes, sickness, and the loss of loved ones. But nothing prepared me for the moment my own flesh and blood looked at me with eyes colder than the Mississippi in December. Brooke was my only daughter. Neil was her chosen partner. Together they should have been my safety net in old age. Instead they cut the ropes and watched me fall. That is where this story begins. With the woman I raised turning her back and the man she married pulling the ground out from under my feet. You see, betrayal doesn't announce itself with thunder. It creeps in quiet like water under a door, and before you know it, your home is flooded and you're standing barefoot in the ruin of everything you built. That's how it happened to me. But let me tell you this, fate has a way of listening. The very restaurant they worshipped, the very table where they boasted of their power, would one day become mine. That is the strange rhythm of life in New Orleans. The same city that can drown you with storms will also lift you on the music of brass horns and gospel choirs. So I begin here. My name is Etta Rose Whitaker. I am 69 years old. I was betrayed by my own daughter and her husband. They left me standing in the street with nothing but a grocery bag of clothes. And yet I lived to sit at their table, not as a guest but as the owner. This is not a tale of revenge dressed in bitterness. This is a tale of survival, dignity, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be erased. And as I speak it aloud, I hope you hear the warning hidden in my words. Blood may tie us, but respect is the knot that holds us together. When that knot is cut, family can become stranger than any stranger you'll ever meet. And so, with my story laid bare, We moved to the beginning of the unraveling, to the days before the storm, when the signs were there, faint but steady, like the rumble of thunder far out on the Gulf. Before everything fell apart, my life looked steady from the outside. I lived in a shotgun house in the Garden District, its porch painted sky blue with rocking chairs that had been in my family for 3 generations. Every morning I swept the steps, watered the little pots of jasmine that climbed my railing, and waved to neighbors who were on their way to work. That house was my anchor. I bought it with my late husband Henry, back when property in New Orleans wasn't selling for gold prices. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Every corner had a memory. The kitchen smelled of gumbo that had simmered for hours. The living room still held a Bible worn thin from my mama's hands. Even the walls carried history. One section still bore faint marks where Henry measured Brooke's height year after year. To me, that house was more than a roof. It was my history stitched in wood and brick. My days were simple but full. I watched my grandson Eli before school. I'd pack him a lunch with a little handwritten note tucked inside. Sometimes I'd sneak him a praline from the candy shop down on Decatur Street. On Sundays I cooked big suppers. Red beans, rice, cornbread, and collard greens. My table was long enough to seat everyone, though most Sundays it ended up just being me, Eli, and my granddaughter Lila. You see, Brooke had changed. When she was younger, she was sweet, even soft-spoken. She used to curl up on the couch beside me and tell me about her dreams, about leaving New Orleans one day, about traveling the world. But after she married Neil, her voice sharpened. She started looking at me differently, as if I were a reminder of the life she wanted to leave behind. Neil was a man of appearances. He called himself a real estate broker, always flashing his gold watch, always talking about leverage and equity. He wasn't from New Orleans, and he carried himself like the city was just a stage for his success. He liked to brag about how he had pulled himself up, but I saw how often he leaned on others to make himself look taller. At first I tried to stay out of their marriage. A mother shouldn't meddle. But I could feel the shift. Brooke's visits grew shorter. Her words carried less warmth. When Neil came around, he'd point at my house and say things like, "This place could be working for you, Etta. You're sitting on a fortune in equity. Why let it rot when it could be paying for your retirement?" I told him once as firm as I could, "This house isn't rotting. It's alive with every breath I've taken in it. It's not for sale." He just smiled, that slick, rehearsed smile, and said, "Everything's for sale if you know the right numbers." That smile of his haunted me. It was the smile of a man already plotting. Meanwhile, Brooke and Neil were climbing socially. Every weekend they dressed to the nines and headed down to the French Quarter, strutting into Palmetto and Pine. That restaurant was their temple, and balcony table 7 was their altar. From that spot, they could look down at the busy street, see and be seen, as though they were royalty perched above the crowd. They would come home bragging about who they sat near: politicians, musicians, business owners. Brooke once told me, with her nose turned slightly upward, "Mama, when people see us there, they know we belong. That table says something about us." I bit my tongue, but I wanted to tell her a table doesn't say a thing. The way you treat your family says everything. So I stayed quiet. I wanted peace. I wanted to believe that if I gave enough of myself, they would see my worth. I took care of Eli and Lila. I cooked meals. I kept their home lives running smooth. I told myself this was just a season, that Brooke would come around, that Neil would learn the meaning of respect. But deep down there was a shadow. I started to notice how Brooke avoided my eyes when I talked about bills or repairs. I noticed how Neil's questions about my health carried too much interest in my paperwork. I brushed it off, told myself I was imagining things. Looking back now, I see it clear. The betrayal didn't strike like lightning. It crept like a tide, slow and quiet, until I was already waist-deep and sinking. I should have seen it in the way Brooke clutched her designer purse tighter when I reached for her hand. I should have heard it in the way Neil talked about my home like it was a prize he had already won. But love has a way of covering our eyes, and I was blind. At the time, I still believed my family was my safety. I had no idea they were sharpening their knives at my very table. It began with a sickness, one I thought would pass quickly. My gallbladder had been giving me trouble. Sharp pains that came like knives under my ribs. The doctor said I needed surgery. It was supposed to be routine, nothing to fear. But at 69, even simple things feel heavy. I went into that hospital trusting my daughter and her husband to keep me safe, to protect my home while I healed. I remember lying in the recovery room, half dazed from anesthesia. The lights above me looked like halos, blurred and spinning. Brooke stood near my bed, her face painted with worry. But behind her, Neil's figure loomed like a shadow waiting for its moment. He spoke softly, almost too kindly. "Etta," he said, "the hospital may need us to handle things for you while you're recovering. Just a simple document. Nothing permanent. Just so we can sign checks or handle bills if something comes up." He held out papers and Brooke placed a pen in my hand. I was weak, my vision cloudy. I trusted them. I didn't read the words. I only heard Brooke whisper, "It's just temporary, Mama. Don't stress." And I signed. That pen stroke was the crack in the foundation of everything I had built. By the time I was back on my feet, the damage was already done. Neil had used that temporary power of attorney to take a cash-out mortgage on my home. My mortgage, which had been steady and manageable for years, had suddenly doubled. Payments I could never afford were now my burden. I didn't even know it until envelopes started arriving, thick, official, stamped with threats. I opened one after another at my kitchen table, my hands trembling as the words swam in front of me. Notice of default. Immediate payment required. Foreclosure proceedings. I called Brooke, my voice shaking. "Baby, what is this? What happened to my house?" She sighed like my panic was an inconvenience. "Mama," Neil explained it. "We just borrowed against the house. Everyone does it. It was supposed to help you." "Help me?" I said, my voice breaking. "Help me by taking the roof from over my head?" Her tone turned sharp. "Don't be dramatic. You're not in your prime anymore. Neil knows money. He can make this work. You just have to trust him." Trust him. Those words felt like poison in my mouth. The final blow came 2 weeks later. I came home from church to find my clothes stuffed in trash bags on the porch. My photo albums were in a box, sitting in the rain. Brooke and Neil stood in the doorway, arms crossed like bouncers at a club. "Mama," Brooke said flatly, "you can't live here anymore. The payments are too high. It's not practical. We've made arrangements." "Arrangements?" I whispered. A car was waiting at the curb. Neil opened the back door. Inside were my belongings, piled like someone moving out in the dead of night. They drove me in silence, past the French Quarter where music floated from balconies, past Bourbon Street where neon lights buzzed. Brooke wouldn't even meet my eyes in the rearview mirror. When the car stopped, I realized where we were. A shelter off Claiborne Avenue. Neil got out first, pulling my bags from the trunk. Brooke finally turned, her voice soft but hollow. "It's just for now, Mama. You'll be fine here. They'll take care of you." And then they drove away. I stood there on the sidewalk, the air damp with the smell of rain and fried food from a corner stand. Around me, people hurried past, not noticing the old woman clutching trash bags of clothes. My whole life, packed into plastic, left on a curb. That night, I lay on a cot with a thin blanket, listening to the sound of strangers coughing, a baby crying, footsteps echoing down hallways. My heart ached in a way no surgeon could fix. And where were Brooke and Neil? At Palmetto and Pine, of course. Sitting at balcony table 7, raising their glasses, laughing over oysters and wine, celebrating the freedom they had bought with my suffering. I could almost hear their voices drifting over the quarter, sweetened by liquor and arrogance. My daughter's laugh, once the sound of my joy, now cut me like broken glass. That was the night I understood the truth. Blood may tie us, but it does not always bind us. I had raised my child, fed her, clothed her, prayed for her, and she left me on the street as if I were nothing more than yesterday's trash. That was the night my heart broke. But it was also the night something else took root. Something quiet, steady, patient. Betrayal had stripped me bare, but beneath the loss, a new resolve began to grow. Because even as I lay on that cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, I whispered to myself, this is not the end of my story. Rock bottom is not one moment. It is a stretch of days that feel the same. The same thin blanket, the same hum of the soda machine in the hallway, the same early morning cough that rattled from the cot 3 beds down. At the shelter off Claiborne Avenue, I learned how small a life can be made. Breakfast was served at 6. The coffee was weak but hot. We lined up with our trays, eyes lowered, each of us wrapped in a quiet we didn't want to break. I kept my few papers inside a manila envelope. Birth certificate, the old mortgage, insurance, and the new documents that had landed in my mailbox like stones. I slid the envelope under my pillow at night. I had already lost my house. I would not lose these papers too. The air smelled of bleach in the mornings and fried food by noon from a stand down the block. If I held still, I could hear traffic on Claiborne, a low rushing sound that never stopped. On my 3rd night there, a woman set a plastic water bottle on the foot of my cot and said, "You're Etta, right?" She was tall, with soft gray at her temples and a name tag that read Miriam. I had seen her before at the intake desk, always moving, always listening. "That's me," I said. She looked at the envelope under my pillow. "You carry that everywhere?" "I do." "Hey, she asked, nodding toward it. "I used to work at Gulf Parish Bank. Loan compliance. I don't want to pry. I recognized the weight of that envelope. I hesitated. Pride is a stubborn thing even when you're sleeping under fluorescent lights. But there was something steady in Miriam's eyes, the steadiness you see in people who have stood in a lot of storms. I handed her the envelope. We sat at a small plastic table near the vending machine. Miriam put on reading glasses and began to sort the papers in tidy stacks. She didn't rush. She read every page, sometimes twice, making small clucks with her tongue at the dates and initials. I folded my hands and watched the door as if Neil might come striding through it to snatch the papers back. He didn't. "This is what happened," Miriam said at last, tapping the so-called temporary power of attorney. "This document is sloppy. See here? The notary stamp is crooked, and the date is the same day as your surgery discharge. It says durable on page 2, but that word is scratched out on the signature page. Your initials aren't on the scratch out. That's a problem. I signed it in the recovery room," I whispered. I couldn't see straight. She nodded. "I believe you. Here's another thing, the cash-out loan. They tacked on an adjustable rate that jumps after 6 months. Balloon clause in the fine print. And this appraisal," she touched the last pages, "is from an outfit I know. They're fast and generous with values when someone needs a high number to justify big cash. So he took money out in my name," I said, my voice small, "and then made the payment too big for me to carry. That's the shape of it." Miriam leaned closer. "Etta, this is not just unfortunate. Parts of this might be fraud. You were under post-op sedation when they slid this under your hand, weren't you?" "Yes." "Then a judge may care about that. We'll want a paper trail. Hospital records, timestamps, your bank statements, anything with dates. There's a legal aid clinic that partners with St. Gabriel Mission on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I can get you a slot. We'll start with a complaint and a demand for records. We'll also ask for the notary's log. If they don't have one or if the time doesn't match, that's leverage." Her word, leverage, made my chest tighten. Neil loved that word. He rolled it around like a pearl in his mouth. But from Miriam it sounded different. It wasn't a boast. It was a tool placed carefully in my palm. I took a breath. Will they listen to me? An old woman who signed without reading. Miriam squeezed my hand. They will listen to facts. And you, my dear, have facts. The next morning I rose before the lights clicked on. I washed my face in cool water and wrapped my scarf tight against a damp breeze that carried the smell of the river. I walked to St. Gabriel Mission, a yellow building with peeling paint and a line at the door. Inside, a church lawyer named Mr. Doucette listened while Miriam outlined the documents. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "We'll file for records and send a letter to the lender. If your son-in-law acted beyond a temporary authority, and if a notary cut corners, we have grounds to challenge." He slid me a list. "Gather what you can. Discharge papers, any texts or emails, copies of envelopes, even the envelopes themselves. Dates matter." Dates. I could do dates. Even in the shelter, I began to build a little station on the table by my cot. I borrowed a pen. I labeled each envelope. I made notes in a small notebook the mission gave me, writing in block letters so my hand wouldn't shake. I felt ridiculous and proud at once, a student starting late in the term. That afternoon I sat outside the mission on a warm concrete step, counting days and receipts. A city bus sighed to a stop. Music drifted from somewhere. A trumpet practicing scales, a radio playing old R&B. A young man came up the sidewalk with a bag of flour on his shoulder, a white dusting on his black t-shirt. He did a double take when he saw me. "Miss Etta," he said, lowering the bag. "It's Andre. From when I was little on Bogart Street. You gave me leftover cornbread while my mama worked nights." I blinked. "Andre. Lord, look at you." He grinned. "I work kitchen at Palmetto and Pine now. Prep line mostly. I saw you once with Miss Brooke and Mr. Neal. You okay?" I opened my mouth to lie, but the truth slipped out. "I'm managing, baby." He shifted, awkward. "I shouldn't gossip, but the place ain't right. Owner's been late on invoices. Tax man came through last month. Chef's worried about payroll. Manager says," he lowered his voice, "they might go to auction. Like, to keep the name clean." My heartbeat stumbled. Auction. Court steps or sealed bids, I don't know. I just chop onions. But I hear things. Mr. Neal been sniffing around the owners, talking fancy, promising investors. He wants the brand but not the staff, far as I can tell. Balcony table 7 flashed across my mind. Brooke's laughter out over Bourbon Street. Neal's watch catching light. I felt a heat climb my neck that wasn't shame this time. "Do you know when?" I asked. "Soon," Andre said. "Mama always said to tell you if she heard anything that mattered. She'd switch me if I kept quiet. He fed me, Miss Etta. I don't forget." He shifted the bag of flour and stepped back. "You need kitchen shifts, I can ask Chef. He remembers you bringing gumbo to the back door after the hurricane." I touched his arm. "Thank you. You already gave me something important." When he left, I sat very still. The traffic, the music, the chatter of people. Everything sounded sharper, like someone had turned a dial and brought the world into focus. Miriam had given me one path. The papers, the law, the slow grind toward fairness. Andre had just pointed me to another. A place where Brooke and Neal had built their image, now standing on shaky legs. That night, under the shelter lights, I spread my papers again. I added a page titled Questions. I wrote, "Who owns Palmetto and Pine? Where are auction notices posted? What is required to bid?" I didn't know those answers yet, but the questions themselves steadied me. At the end of the row, someone coughed. A baby cried. The soda machine hummed. I pressed my palm to the envelope and closed my eyes. I was tired, but a small thread of hope ran through me, thin but strong, like a line you can hold on to when the water is high. I was still at the bottom. I had no house keys, no closet to hang a dress in, no stove to simmer a pot on. But I had 2 new truths. The papers might be dirty, and the temple where my daughter worshipped was struggling. Both truths were doors. I just had to learn how to open them, quietly, carefully, without letting the wrong people hear the hinges creak. When the lights went out, I whispered to the dark, "Tomorrow we begin with dates. Then we find the notice board." And for the first time since the night I was left on the curb, I slept without waking from the kind of dream that leaves your heart pounding like a house with the lights off. Opportunity doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in the middle of chaos, and if you're quiet enough, you hear it. After Miriam and Andre opened my eyes, my days began to take on new shape. I still slept on a narrow cot under the buzzing fluorescent lights, but now I woke with purpose. Instead of just surviving, I started planning. First came the papers. Every Tuesday and Thursday I walked to St. Gabriel Mission, carrying my envelope of documents like it was made of gold. Mr. Doucette, the church lawyer, explained each step we'd take. He said words like voidable authority and breach of fiduciary duty, and though I didn't understand all of it, I understood one thing. Neil had crossed a line. We filed requests for hospital records and notary logs. Miriam showed me how to make a timeline. Dates of surgery, dates on documents, dates of the mortgage draw. With every detail I wrote down, the knot in my stomach loosened just a little. It was proof. Proof that I hadn't imagined the betrayal. Proof that the law might one day see what my heart already knew. But the restaurant, that was something else. Andre's words about an auction clung to me like humidity in July. Palmetto and Pine was not just a building. It was the shrine where Brooke and Neil went to polish their image. Every Sunday they sat at balcony table 7, lifting their glasses high while the city buzzed beneath them. To see that place falter, to know it might slip from their grasp, it stirred something in me that was not bitterness but resolve. I began to ask quiet questions. At the mission, I struck up conversations with people who worked odd jobs downtown. I listened more than I spoke. Bit by bit, I learned that Palmetto and Pine owed back taxes and had missed payroll more than once. A notice was expected in the parish records soon. That's when Miriam said, "Etta, if this auction happens, you could be in position to make a move." I laughed at first. Me? I don't have a dime beyond what I scrape from cleaning jobs. But she looked me straight in the eye. Don't underestimate yourself. Auctions aren't always about the highest bid. Sometimes they're about who shows up prepared, who has backing, who knows the rules. And you, my dear, you've got a reason stronger than money. That counts for something. Her words stayed with me. That night I lay on my cot staring at the ceiling and I thought about strength. My strength had always gone to others. Raising Brooke, feeding Eli and Lila, keeping a house standing through storms. Maybe it was time my strength built something for me. The next week, Miriam helped me fill out papers to form a tiny company, an LLC. We called it Rose and Sparrow, after my middle name and a hymn Mama used to sing. It cost almost nothing to file. The mission covered the fee from their charity fund. Holding that stamped document in my hands, I felt something stir inside me. A seed of ownership, of possibility. Meanwhile, I took small jobs wherever I could. I cleaned offices at night, folded laundry for neighbors, even washed dishes in the mission kitchen. Each dollar went into a coffee tin I kept under my cot. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Andre slipped me more news whenever he could. "Vendors ain't been paid in 2 months, he whispered once. Another time, "Chef says if auction happens it'll be quick. Closed bid, not courthouse steps. Few weeks, maybe less." Every whisper was a thread and I was weaving them into a rope I could climb. So I kept everything to myself. Not a word to Brooke, not a word to Neil. I saw them once by chance passing through the quarter. They were dressed sharp as always, Brooke's arm linked through his, her laugh trailing behind like perfume. They didn't see me tucked in the crowd. For a moment I felt the old ache, the sting of being invisible to the child I had carried in my own body. But then I thought of Rose and Sparrow, of the papers under my pillow, of balcony table 7 trembling under the weight of unpaid bills. I whispered to myself, they think they built a kingdom. They don't see the cracks in the walls. What I didn't know then was just how fast those cracks would spread. But I was readying myself. Quietly, carefully, patiently. Like a pot of gumbo simmering slow, letting the flavors deepen, I was preparing. One day when the lid lifted, the world would taste what had been building all along. The thing about pride is it doesn't collapse quietly. It cracks first like plaster on an old wall, then it begins to crumble in pieces. I started to see the cracks forming in Brooke and Neil's lives, even from the shadows where they thought I no longer existed. Word traveled fast in New Orleans, especially in the French Quarter, where gossip slips through shutters like music. From Miriam, from Andre, even from neighbors who still whispered news to me, I learned that Neil's big real estate flips had stalled. He'd stretched himself too thin. Houses bought on credit, condos no one wanted, and investors who were losing patience. At first they hid it well. Brooke still posted pictures of cocktails at Palmetto and Pine, of shopping bags on Royal Street, of smiling faces at balcony table 7. But the shine wasn't real anymore. Friends who once crowded around them began to drift away. People notice when the bills aren't paid, when the waiter waits too long for a tip, when the maitre d' no longer rushes to hold the door. I heard from Andre that the staff at Palmetto and Pine were restless. Payroll was late again. Vendors stopped delivering on credit. The chef slammed pans in the kitchen, shouting that a place can't run on promises. Brooke and Neil clung to their table, but it was like clinging to driftwood in a storm. One Sunday evening, I watched from across the street as they stepped out of the restaurant. Brooke's heels clicked sharp on the sidewalk. She looked thinner, her smile stretched tight like fabric pulled too far. Neil was on his phone, his voice raised, his hand slicing the air. Even from where I stood, I could see the frustration etched in the set of his jaw. I thought of all the times he'd told me, real estate is about leverage, Etta. You've got to use what you've got before it rots. And I realized he had leveraged too much. He had turned his whole life into one long gamble. Brooke, for all her airs, was not blind. She started calling Miriam, of all people, trying to ask if she knew anything about the mortgage case. Miriam told me, shaking her head, "Your daughter is nervous." She asked if you had grounds to contest. I told her only the judge can say. Hearing that, I felt something stir in me. For once, it was Brooke who feared being left out in the cold. But I stayed silent. Silence is a kind of power, and I learned to hold it close. At the mission, I kept building my file with Mr. Doucette. At night, I stacked every page neatly, like bricks in a wall I was raising around myself. Each paper was proof that I was not powerless. Proof that their betrayal had limits. Meanwhile, whispers of the auction grew louder. Andre told me the owners of Palmetto and Pine were desperate. The tax office had filed liens. The bank wanted out. "Closed bid, Miss Etta," he said, glancing over his shoulder like the walls might have ears. "Soon. Real soon." I nodded, keeping my face calm though my heart hammered. One night, walking back to the shelter, I passed by the restaurant. Music floated from the balcony, a saxophone, low and mournful. I stood in the shadows and looked up at balcony table 7. Brooke sat there, her chin resting on her hand, her smile gone. Neil was talking fast, his hands moving in sharp cuts through the air. She looked away, down into the street, and for a moment her eyes swept over the crowd below. Did she see me standing there, half hidden under the glow of the streetlight? If she did, she didn't stop. She turned back to Neil, nodded, and raised her glass with a hand that trembled just enough for me to notice. That night I whispered to myself, "The tide is turning." As it was. Their world was shrinking, and mine, though still small, though still fragile, was growing steadier by the day. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need their approval. What I needed was the right moment, the right opening, and patience enough to wait for it. And patience is something a woman like me has in her bones. The morning of the auction felt quiet, too quiet for what it was. I woke before the shelter lights clicked on, washed my face with cool water, and dressed in the same church blouse I wore to Henry's funeral. Not fancy, just respectful. Miriam met me out front with a paper cup of chicory coffee and that steady look of hers. We didn't talk much. Words felt fragile, and I didn't want to waste a single one. At St. Gabriel Mission, Mr. Doucette laid everything out on a folding table. My Rose and Sparrow LC papers, a cashier's check for the deposit, pulled together by a small community fund and a lender that still believed in widows who kept their promises, and the sealed bid he had prepared after studying the liens and the bank's appetite to be done. "We're not swinging at the moon," he said. "We're meeting the reserve with a breath to spare. If bigger fish show, we bow out with dignity." If they don't, we walk out owners. I nodded. Dignity first. Ownership if God was willing. The auction was held in a dull office above a title company on Poydras. No drama, no gavel, no crowd. Just a receiver in a gray suit, a conference table that smelled faintly of lemon oil, and 3 sealed envelopes. One from a holding company I didn't recognize, and one that made my stomach tighten. Landry Daniels Investments, Neil's creation. He hadn't let the scent go. He wanted the name, the mailing list, the balcony view. He wanted the staff only long enough to turn the lock. We handed in our envelope. The receiver checked our deposit, stamped a form, and told us to wait in the hall. Miriam sat beside me, hands folded, calm as a chapel pew. I tried to listen to the hum of the building, the copier, the elevator bell, footsteps in the stairwell. But all I could hear was my heart, steady and hard like a drum in my chest. They called us back in after what felt like a lifetime. The receiver slid open the first bid. Landry Daniels. He read the number and made a small face, too cautious by a mile. The second, the holding company, was higher but lopsided with conditions. Then he opened ours. He read it twice, then looked up at me as if really seeing me for the first time. Rose and Sparrow meets the reserve cleanly, funds verified, he said. If there are no objections, we'll proceed to closing. He turned to the other 2 representatives. Neil's man, a junior in a tight suit, lifted his phone, whispered, and then shook his head with a stiff smile. The holding company rep deflated. The receiver signed, I signed, Mr. Doucette signed. Efficient, almost plain. And then he did something extra, the piece we had requested in a separate bill of sale. Fixtures and furnishings itemized. Booths, chairs, the mirrored bar, the host stand, and one line written in Mr. Doucette's neat hand, balcony table 7 with accompanying chairs. I didn't breathe until the pen left the paper. Then breath came back like a held breath released. We stepped into the hallway. Miriam hugged me bone to bone. You did it, she whispered. You did it the right way. I nodded, because anything more and I would have cried too hard to stop. By noon we'd been to the parish office, filed what needed filing and copied what needed copying. Andre met us at the back alley of palmetto and pine, an apron still tied around his waist, flour dust on his sleeve. Chef's in the walk-in pretending to count scallops, he said with a grin, eyes bright. He cried when I told him you were coming. I laughed, and the sound surprised me. It had been months since laughter felt natural in my mouth. The dining room was closed between lunch and dinner, sunlight slanting through tall windows onto empty plates set for no one yet. I ran my fingers over the host stand. The wood was smooth from years of greetings. In the kitchen, Chef wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and tried to stand straighter. Madam, he said, voice shaking. We've been starving on promises. Tell me the new promise. Paydays come on Fridays and not a day late, I said. Vendors will be called tonight with a plan that puts food back in their houses first. No one gets yelled at for telling the truth. We clean what needs cleaning and we tell the city we're staying. He put a hand to his chest and nodded. We had until Sunday brunch before the world would notice. That was fine. I wanted the reveal to be public and simple without shouting. I wanted witnesses not because I needed applause, but because a story told in daylight can't be twisted into a lie as easily. Saturday we scrubbed floors and polished the brass rail. I stood on the balcony while Andre wiped down the ironwork, looking at the street below where I had once felt small. I touched the back of balcony chair 7 and thought of Brooke's manicured hand resting there. I thought of Neil's watch catching sunlight. I prayed, not for vengeance, but for clarity when the moment came to speak. Sunday arrived warm and bright. Church bells were still ringing when I walked through the front door in a simple dress and the best shoes I owned. The host, a young woman who had always been kind to me, smiled and straightened when she saw Miriam and Mr. Doucette on either side of me. Chef and Andre stood a respectful step behind, heads high. Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker, the host said, voice soft with pride. Your table is ready. High table, I repeated, and we walked not to a corner or a back booth, but up the stairs to the balcony everyone knew. We set 3 menus at balcony table 7. I didn't sit right away. I stood by the railing and looked out at Bourbon Street waking up. Tourists with cameras, a street musician testing a horn, a police horse tossing its head as an officer murmured to it. The city looked back at me and didn't blink. I had left this street in a car that smelled like my daughter's perfume. I had returned by the front door with a deed in my purse. At 11:30 they came. Brooke in a cream dress too thin for the season, sunglasses pushed up like a crown. Neil in a suit he wanted people to notice, his jaw set for a victory that had already slipped away from him and didn't know it yet. They breezed through the door with an old entitlement, the kind that expects the world to part. The host stepped forward. "Good morning," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" Brooke laughed lightly. "We never need one for the balcony." "Today we do take reservations," the host replied, still gentle. "But I believe the owner left a note." Neil opened his mouth to object, and then he saw me. He didn't recognize me at first. People rarely do when they've decided you're invisible. Then his eyes sharpened. Brooke followed his gaze, those sunglasses slipping just an inch. The air around our table shifted, quiet as a held breath. I pulled out the chair and sat, Miriam and Mr. Doucette sitting with me. Chef moved to stand behind, hands folded, not as a servant, but as a man choosing where to give his skill. André stood at the rail, chin up. I placed the deed and the bill of sale on the linen, not waving them, not brandishing, just resting my hand on them like you do a family Bible. "Good morning," I said, my voice even. "Welcome to my restaurant." Brooke's mouth opened and closed. Color rose high in her cheeks. Neil took a single step forward, then checked himself when he saw Mr. Doucette's calm gaze and the folded documents. For a long beat no one spoke. Sunlight slid over the tablecloth. Down on the street, a horn began a slow, sweet run of notes. "I believe you were fond of this table," I added, tapping the corner of the paper that named Balcony Table 7. "I was too. Enough to make sure it has a good home." Brooke found her voice first. "Mama, what is this?" she whispered, as if the question could undo ink and signatures. "It's a new day," I said. "You may stay to eat if you wish. The menu's honest food. The staff will be paid on time. And if you'd like to make a reservation next Sunday, the host can help you." Neil swallowed hard. He was calculating, I could see it. The angles, the leverage, the lie that might still save face. But there was nothing to grab hold of. Not here. Not now. Not with the room watching and the papers resting plain as sunlight on linen. People didn't clap. This wasn't theater. But the dining room went still in that respectful way New Orleans has when it recognizes a moment of truth. The roles had turned without shouting. I wasn't the woman left on a curb with trash bags. I was the woman who could decide whom to welcome and how to keep her house. I picked up the menu. "Shrimp and grits, I think," I told the host. "And coffee strong." She smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She turned to Brooke and Neil, kind as ever. "Would you like a table or some time to decide?" They didn't answer at once. They weren't ready for the world to see them smaller than they had pictured themselves. That was fine. I wasn't in a hurry. The city wasn't either. And that is how the reveal came, not with noise but with steady light. I took my seat and the restaurant took a breath with me. Next came the words that had to be said and the papers that had to be served. But those belonged to what followed when the picture people had of us finally cracked and the truth stepped through. The reveal was like pulling back a curtain. For a heartbeat, Brooke and Neil stood frozen, masks slipping in front of a dining room full of witnesses. Then the storm came. Neil was the first to break. He stepped toward me, his voice low at first, then rising like steam off hot pavement. "You think this is yours? You don't know what you've gotten yourself into, Etta. Restaurants bleed money. You'll drown in debt before you make your first payroll." I let him finish, my hands folded calmly on the deed. Then I nodded to Mr. Doucette, who slid a manila envelope across the table. Neil hesitated before touching it, but when he did, his face drained of color. Inside were the preliminary filings, notice of pending action for fraud, requests for records, and a statement of intent to challenge the mortgage he had saddled me with. "You can talk to my lawyer," I said quietly. "From now on, that's the only voice I'll answer." The room had gone still. Diners who had been cutting into omelets or sipping chicory coffee paused, forks suspended. The wait staff hovered at the edges, trying not to stare but unable to look away. This wasn't a family spat. This was justice arriving in daylight. Brooke finally spoke, her voice breaking. "Mama, why are you doing this to me? To us? We were trying to help. You don't understand the pressure we're under." Neil only wanted. "Don't," I said sharper than I meant. "Don't dress betrayal as help. You left me on the street like I was nothing. That wasn't pressure, Brooke. That was choice." Her hand trembled as she reached for the back of a chair, steadying herself. I saw the girl she used to be flicker for a moment, the one who once curled into my lap after nightmares, whispering she was scared of the dark. But grown women make their own shadows, and Brooke had chosen hers. Neil tried again, leaning in close. "You think these people stand with you? Staff, vendors, lawyers. They'll all turn when the money runs thin. And then where will you be?" Chef stepped forward from the kitchen door, wiping his hands on his apron. "She will be here," he said firmly in his thick Cajun accent. "With us. Paid on time. Fed well. That is enough." His voice carried across the room like the strike of a bell. Andre came to stand beside him, chin lifted. "And if you don't like it, Mr. Daniels, you can eat somewhere else." Murmurs spread through the dining room. A woman near the bar clapped once, softly, and though it didn't grow into applause, the gesture held weight. Neil's face flushed crimson. Brooke tugged at his arm, whispering, "Please, let's go." But Neil yanked free, glaring at me one last time before storming toward the stairs. Brooke followed, her sunglasses trembling in her hand, her composure slipping like a mask that no longer fit. When the door closed behind them, the room exhaled. The clatter of forks returned, the low hum of conversation resumed, but with a new undercurrent. People looked at me differently, not as a burden, not as a discarded elder, but as someone who had taken her seat with quiet strength. I sat back in my chair and finally let the breath escape my lungs. Miriam touched my hand gently. "That was the hardest part," she whispered. I shook my head. "No, child. The hardest part was the night they left me on the curb. I glanced around the dining room at the staff, at the papers resting solid on the table. "This is the beginning." The aftermath wasn't loud or violent. It was steady like the tide coming in. And for the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath my feet again, solid, sure, and mine. Fallout doesn't come in one piece. It comes in waves, each one carrying a little more than the last. The week after that Sunday brunch, I saw the waves begin to roll. Neil, full of bluster, tried to push back through lawyers. He filed objections, sent letters claiming I was unfit to manage, that I was being influenced by outsiders. Mr. Doucette met each paper with calm precision. "The documents speak for themselves," he said, sliding another response across the table. "They'll bury themselves if they keep digging." At the same time, the court acknowledged our complaint against the fraudulent mortgage. That was the first moment I felt truly heard by the system. It wasn't over, not by a long stretch, but the judge agreed to examine the notary's records and the timing of my signature. Neil had thought no one would care about an old woman's scribbled name in a hospital bed. He was wrong. Brooke called me one evening. I didn't recognize the number, but when I heard her voice, my heart pinched. "Mama, please," she whispered. "Can't we stop this? You're making things worse." I held the phone tight, my eyes fixed on the empty dining room before dinner service. "Worse, Brooke? You left me with trash bags on a curb. Tell me, how much worse could it be?" She started to cry, but the tears felt thin, as if they belonged more to shame than sorrow. "I was scared," she said. "We were drowning. Neil said it was the only way. I was your mother. I said softly. Not your bank. Not your burden to shift. Your mother. And you left me. Silence stretched between us. At last I told her, if you want forgiveness, it won't come by phone. It will come by truth and by change. Until then, don't call me to ease your conscience. I hung up with hands that trembled, but not from weakness. From release. At Palmetto and Pine, things began to bloom. Staff who had been tense and uncertain started to relax. Paychecks went out on Fridays as promised. Vendors delivered on time again, shaking hands with me at the back door. We opened the balcony to live jazz on Thursdays, a small trio that played soft while people ate. The city began to notice, not because of scandal but because of steadiness. Still, I didn't let pride cloud me. I knew the work ahead was long, and I knew Neil wasn't finished scheming. But his voice no longer filled my days. Mine did. One Sunday, Brooke walked into the restaurant alone. No sunglasses, no fancy dress. Just a simple blouse, her hair pulled back like when she was a girl. She stood at the host stand, uncertain. "May I sit?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I gestured to a small table near the window, not balcony table 7. That table remained mine, a reminder, a boundary. She sat quietly, ordered a bowl of gumbo, and ate every bite without saying much. When she left, she looked back once, tears clinging to her lashes. I didn't call after her. Because resolution isn't always reconciliation. Sometimes it's setting the table, letting someone sit, and seeing whether they choose honesty or fall back into old habits. I wasn't closing the door on my daughter, but I wasn't swinging it wide open either. For the first time in months, I felt balance returning. The betrayal had left scars, yes, but scars are proof you've healed enough to keep moving. There comes a moment after the storm when you realize the air smells different. The heaviness has lifted. The sky doesn't feel so low anymore. That's where I found myself months after the auction, standing on the balcony of Palmetto and Pine, coffee in hand, watching the French Quarter wake up. The restaurant was steady now. Not rich, not flashy, steady. Staff showed up on time because they knew they'd be respected. Vendors delivered because they trusted us to pay. Customers came not for gossip or spectacle but for food and music that felt like home. Every Thursday the jazz trio played and I'd sit near the kitchen door, nodding along while Andre grinned over his bass line. Balcony table 7 remained mine. Sometimes I sat there alone, notebook open, writing down payroll numbers or notes for the next week. Other times I invited community elders or a young couple celebrating their anniversary. It wasn't a throne, not to me. It was a reminder. A piece of wood and iron that once symbolized my exile, now reclaimed as my seat of dignity. As for Neil, the law did what it was meant to do. The judge ruled that the temporary power of attorney was invalid. The mortgage was unwound, the lien lifted, and restitution ordered. Neil blustered and fought, but the papers held stronger than his words. His investors drifted away, tired of his empty promises. The last I heard, he was trying to sell smaller properties. His empire shrunk to scraps. Brooke. She lingered on the edges of my life. Some Sundays she came to the restaurant. Never balcony table 7, never with Neil. She'd sit by the window, sometimes with Eli or Lila, sometimes alone. She'd eat quietly, pay her bill, and leave. Once she slipped a note under her bowl. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix it." I kept that note. Not because it healed me, it didn't. But because it reminded me that regret is its own burden, one I no longer had to carry for her. Forgiveness is a long road, and I'm not at the end of it yet. But I'm walking it slow and steady, like a woman who knows where her feet belong. One evening, Miriam sat with me after closing. We watched the lights flicker on across Bourbon Street, tourists laughing, brass horns warming up on the corner. "You've built something here," she said softly. "I didn't build it alone," I answered. "I just refused to let it be taken." She nodded, smiling. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Refusal. The rest follows." He was right. Refusal to bow. Refusal to vanish. Refusal to let betrayal be the final word. So here I am, 69 years old, owner of a restaurant I never imagined, guardian of a table that once symbolized my exile and now stands for my return. Life has a way of circling back, of setting the table anew if you can bear the hunger long enough. If you're listening to this, know this truth. Family can wound you deeper than any stranger, but you are not defined by the wounds. You are defined by the way you rise after. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your own story in the comments. Your voice matters.